All right, now we're going to have an interesting conversation with Jordan Sekulow. He is the Director of International Operations for the American Center for Law and Justice. Jordan, welcome to the Young Turks.
Thanks for having me on.
All right, we appreciate your time, man. We got a new poll out from Pew saying that 80% of Americans roughly are dissatisfied with their government. Why do you think that's the case, Jordan?
I think it's a couple things, and I think it relates back actually to President Obama's State of the Union address this year when he talked about the economic problems we face. And I think Americans started kind of scratching their head and saying, hey, if these economic problems, which President Obama comes out and campaigned on saying these were inherited by the Bush-Cheney White House, it's the president's fault, I'm inheriting this horrible economy. He spends his first year of his presidency pushing the health care law, which was very divisive, and of course has led to what I think will be some massive defeats for Democrats in November. But as point number two is the president talked so much about the economy in that State of the Union, yet really hasn't made the moves to start job creation. I think that's got the American people just sitting back and saying, what's going on here? You told us all that it was President Bush's fault. This economy's horrible, and I'm going to come in and fix it, and you spend a year on this divisive health care plan that I think still no one really understands. Doctors can't answer the questions about. We don't know the full implications of. And I know you've talked a lot about banking reform. There's another issue where people have to have it explained to them. You can't just start talking about derivatives and the different kinds of stock trades that are going on here and go after Goldman Sachs without explaining it to the American people.
All right, so then I assume you're in favor, because you're saying he should have spent more time on the economy. So then you're obviously in favor of the jobs bill, the stimulus package, and the financial reform now.
You know, I don't like the stimulus package. I especially don't like the fact that the government took over a failing car industry. I think in America you have to let capitalism work, and that means if a car company is not doing so great, don't go in there and bail it out. And if you're going to do so, don't hold on to the shares, which the president's continued to do in this administration, basically making General Motors now part of the United States taxpayers, owned motor company, something that's failing. And I think bailing out companies who are failing as well is not a good thing for the market. It leads to the same kind of progress where you've got Democrats today coming out talking about this new financial reform bill, calling it another bailout for Wall Street. That's not what the American people want. And if Democrats are saying it, imagine what conservative Americans think.
Well, first of all, I don't know which Democrats you're referring to. Second of all, I think the financial reform package is far too weak. So then I assume you agree that we should make it much tougher. We should regulate the banks so they can't take those extreme risks and destroy the economy again.
I'm one of those conservatives that actually understands the need for regulation, and I've talked about it a lot before, and it was actually as Congressman Brad Sherman, who represents some of L.A. County and parts of the Valley in California, he came out and called it the bailout. This is, again, a Democrat, a liberal Democrat, saying this doesn't go far enough, just helping these executives at these businesses. And
wait. No, but Jordan, you got to explain that. I mean, because, I think the reform package is way too weak, but when you say it's a bailout of the bankers, you keep saying a Democrat said it as if that means anything to me. Why? Tell me why you think it's a bailout.
Here's why it's a bailout. It allows Washington to continue to be able to have this free reign to decide when they want to bail out a company. Instead of having restrictions in place, it kind of clears the way for Washington politicians to decide when to bail out the companies. I think that's been the problem throughout this financial reform.
All right, but then, so Jordan, how would you do it? Maybe we agree on this. I don't know. So the next time there's a calamity in one of the banks or many of the banks, what would you do?
Well, I think you've got to put in regulations on the collateral debt obligations, on the derivative trading, this kind of instance that people don't understand the kind of bad mortgages that they were buying into. Listen, I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat or conservative or liberal. People lost a lot of money in what happened with the stock market and what was going on in Wall Street. And, unfortunately, and you know this very well, both political parties are tied in. You were talking about Geithner before. Whoever's running the Treasury Department, the Commerce Department, they've all got their ties, and the Federal Reserve and the Federal Bank,
all right,
they've all got ties.
No, I agree with that. But, Jordan, you know that the Republican Party is dead set against that. I mean, if you said, hey, for example, these naked credit default swaps are just basically gambling, we're not going to allow them anymore, there's no way in hell the Republican Party would sign on for that.
Listen, I think Senator Corker was close. I think Senator Corker on the Senate Finance Committee was working with Senator Dodd as much as possible, and instead Senator Dodd decided to just go through and take it to the floor. And when you have this now battled on the floor, it may not have any Republican support at all. I know all 41 Republicans signed a letter saying that.
Wait. Now, look, they negotiated with the Republicans for months on end on health care. That's why it took a year. You were complaining it took a whole year. Now they're doing the same thing with financial reform, but then
I wouldn't go so far as to say they negotiated with the Republicans over a year, because no Republicans supported it.
But that's the whole problem, Jordan.
There's no compromise in Washington.
No.
And you want to point to the American people not supporting it? There you go.
No, Jordan, that's the whole problem. No, you negotiate with them, and you give them, in the case of health care reform, they give them 150 amendments. In the case of financial reform, I'll give you specifics. Corker had an agreement to take the Consumer Financial Protection Agency. Well, they didn't want it in the first place. The Republicans didn't, so that's less regulation of the banks. But okay, if you have to have it, put it in the Fed, because they know the Fed doesn't really regulate. So they're trying to make the bill weaker, and then the Democrats agree to that, and they still won't sign on. You know the Republicans aren't going to sign on no matter what they gave them.
Listen, I'm not going to tell you that I think Republicans are going to sign on, because that is wrong. But I will tell you what I think the president could do better, not just for his own party, but for American independents, people who are not so tied to partisan politics, is to explain what these reforms are about, to explain, instead of Timothy Geithner kind of going back and dodging these questions, and it's tough to understand. I mean, listen, if you're not following economics closely, you have no idea what they're talking about when they talk about collateral debt obligations or derivative trading. That doesn't fly with most people. It's just, let's take it back to common sense. But if Democrats decide not to do that, just to push another reform through that their own party is criticizing, that progressives in the party don't think goes far enough, what do you think that's going to do for the American people's trust in the party? They're going to say, President Obama promised so much, and guess what? Nothing changed.
We're talking to Jordan Sekulow. He's the Director of International Operations for the American Center for Law and Justice. Jordan, so what do you want them to do? Because you're saying, no, they're going to push this through and it's partisan, et cetera. Well, but you also said the Republicans won't sign on to it. So, I mean, if I'm the Democrats, what I would do is I'd make it 10 times tougher and then say, sign it if you like, don't sign it if you don't like. It's up to you. So are you on board with that?
If they had the backbone to do it, I'd be all for it. But I don't think they have the backbone to do that. They're just as tied. They need those campaign contributions, just so maybe even more this November. So they're going to be looking not to offend too many bankers. President Obama may point out someone like Goldman Sachs, and that's important to rally around right now. Of course, Republicans started turning back any contributions they got from the Goldman Sachs crew, and President Obama hasn't done so yet. And he received, I think, over $900,000 from people associated with Goldman Sachs. He hasn't turned that money back. Republicans have. So they're getting the message.
No. Okay, now there's an important thing there. Now, look, when you say about Goldman Sachs and how much they gave to Obama, that's exactly right, and we're very concerned about that. But the Republicans just had a meeting with 25 of the top bankers in the country, Mitch McConnell and John Cornyn did, and then McConnell comes in and tries to kill financial reform, and all 41 of them sign on to take down what is already incredibly weak reform and try to make it weaker or kill it. I mean, isn't it obvious from that meeting that they had with those bankers that the Republicans, after things like John Boehner saying, hey, you should have buyer's remorse with the Democrats, give us your money instead, isn't it obvious the Republicans are on the bankers' side?
Well, we'll see in November what happens and see whether the American people care about that or make that connection. But I will say one problem.
So you agree, but you're not sure the American people are going to understand that they.
No, I don't think the American. I think one thing the American people do understand is that what all these different industries have said, just like the healthcare industry said during the healthcare law, that this was going to hurt jobs, this was going to make insurance premiums go up, just like liberal progressives said this didn't go far enough because of that fact that premiums were going to continue to rise and
That's
people
right.
were still going to get dropped. Here's the thing with banking reform. If you make this sweeping move at the derivatives trade, instead of doing it over some kind of progression, you're talking about estimates of $11 billion a year lost in profit. Our banks fall to the rest of the world's banking industry, especially Western Europe's banking industry and the Asian banking industry, and we're no longer competing against.
See, but now you're back to defending the banks, because our banks did fall. They fell because they were doing those risky derivatives, not because we stopped them. If we stopped them and, the other banks and foreign banks had this so-called competitive advantage, then their banks would fall and ours would remain sound. I'm totally on board for that.
Well, look, I think at the end of the day, when you're having this discussion on where the banking reform needs to go, everyone in America agrees, I don't care if they're a Republican or a Democrat, that something has to be done. The Goldman Sachs example is a perfect example of people being hoodwinked into deals, sold mortgages that were just junk mortgages basically right off the top of the bat. People are going to be brought to justice over that. Under the Bush administration, the same kind of moves were being made. The same kind of people are in the leadership position. President Obama came in, Bernanke's still there. That's what people have got to understand and point out and I think that's what, when you tie back into this poll where 4 out of 5 Americans don't trust Washington. They don't trust Washington, and I especially think with all the young people. I worked on 2 Republican campaigns where I did youth outreach for the Bush Cheney and Mitt Romney, and young people got so excited about President Obama they thought there was going to be all this change in Washington. When it comes to the financial industry specifically, there hasn't been any change. There's been a lot of talk about tough reforms, but if it comes down to partisan politics that end up backfiring and hurting our banking industry in the immediate future, that's going to backfire for Democrats and progressive candidates come the fall.
Jordan, actually, we agree a lot on that because I think the Democrats are not going nearly strong enough. They're not delivering what they promised, and they're going to pay the price. So yeah, Ben Bernanke should have never been reappointed. He was Bush's pick in the first place, Geithner, et cetera, et cetera. But it's not like the Republicans can take any credit. Unfortunately, we're out of choices. If you go to the Republicans, including the guys you work for, like Mitt Romney, they're 10 times more in the till for the banks.
Well, listen, they're willing to do things that are right for the American economy and I think make tough choices, and they do what they run on. President Obama hasn't done that. And
well, that's what I'm afraid of, though. Jordan, that's what I'm afraid of. They do what they run on, and what they run on is, no, believe me, we're going to help out the bankers.
Yeah, but if Republicans are running up front with these campaigns, and they're being honest about what they're running about, they're being honest about their support, they're being honest about the fact they want less government in people's life, less regulation. I'm not saying there shouldn't be more regulation on banking, but overall, there shouldn't be a mediocre government takeover of health care. That's not going to solve the problems. People know what they're getting. With President Obama, they thought they were getting a progressive kind of, I'd say much more to the left than just down the road, but a real progressive in office who was going to make sweeping changes. They handed him supermajorities in the House and the Senate, and what did he do? I think he squandered an entire year of his first presidency on a health care bill that ended up being a massive compromise that isn't supported by people on the left. It's not supported by people on the right, and people by the middle are now being upset about it, which is why you've got all these independents, people who left the Republican and Democrat Party, saying, you know what, I've had enough, and they're fed up about it, and they're on the streets.
Yeah, Jordan, on that last point, we're in nearly complete agreement. Okay, yeah, they didn't do what they said they were going to do, and they should have. They should have done what the Republicans do. And what they promised was good. What the Republicans promised, in my opinion, is not good, but that's why I don't vote for them. But the Democrats are going to have this kind of protest and this kind of, distrust of the government if they don't deliver on their promises. So we agree on that. Final thing for you. Earlier you mentioned about the stimulus package, and you said he didn't spend the year enough on. But there was a stimulus package, there was the jobs bill. Now they're trying financial reform. I guess my question to you is, if you thought those were insufficient or wrong way to go, what would you have done for the year?
Stop scaring people about the healthcare system, which was freaking people out across the country.
But that has nothing to do with jobs. And
it does have to do with jobs because it has to do with the economy and how people spend. Stop telling people you're going to raise their taxes, threaten a tax raise, threaten things like a VAT tax, a value-added tax. When you start doing that, it's not good for the markets, which then translates into consumers get scared. President Obama scared the American people during his campaign in 2008, saying, if we continue down this road, we're going to, Great Depression Part 2. And instead spent the first year, instead of getting some bipartisan compromise, even though he only needed to maybe didn't need them, he didn't pass it through. He waited until he lost Ted Kennedy's seat in the U.S. Senate and didn't get through the financial reforms necessary. There were some Republicans who supported the job bill. In fact, Scott Brown, who took that seat. So to wipe away and say it's all Republicans standing in the way of this, President Obama has one group to blame. It's Democrats. It has nothing to do. Republicans aren't standing in the way of anything he wants to do. He has to pick off one Republican to fight filibuster in the U.S. Senate, supermajorities in the House. It's the Democrats' fault, not Republicans.
Jordan, you keep making an argument for why Democrats should be more progressive. So I guess I agree with you.
I would like Democrats to be more progressive because I think it'd be better for Republicans in the polls.
Oh yeah, well that we definitely disagree on. But so just to touch on one thing we disagree. You said there are taxes that he scared people by saying he's going to raise their taxes, but he didn't. He cut taxes for everybody making under $250,000 if they're a family. He only raised taxes for the top brackets. I mean, then when you say, hey, those tax cuts or those tax increases are bad, it appears that you're defending the rich, right?
Well, who drives the economy? I mean, $250,000 a year. You live in New York. That's not that much money for a family of four. So if you're making, let's say, $400,000 or $500,000 a year, that may be the reason you didn't buy a new car, that you didn't take a trip across the country, that you didn't rent the hotel room that was more expensive, that you didn't go out to dinner, and because of that, it affects the entire economy because it means, well, you know what, I've got a small company, maybe I've got an S corporation, 10, 15 employees, I'm the boss. I'm going to have to let a couple more go because I'm getting taxed more personally. That's the kind of problems that happen when you start just saying we're going to tax $250,000 or more to try to say to the American people like that's now the super rich of the country. That's not the super rich of the country. That's who drives the economy of the country.
That's perfect, Jordan. If you think $250,000 is not a lot of money and that those people need to get tax cuts so they could buy bigger SUVs, well, we disagree.
If they get to buy bigger SUVs, that means a lot more guys at the factory building those SUVs.
Sure. And giving those tremendous tax cuts during the Bush years to that top 2% of the country, how did that wind up for you?
Listen, at the end of the day, if the tax cuts were extended, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in right now.
Wait a minute, we got in the mess because of the tax cuts. We had 8 years of tax cuts. The mess didn't start under Obama. The collapse was under Bush.
But you're not talking about massive tax. You're talking about tax breaks that President Bush had. Again, I think we have to, if you want to get into them, there are tax breaks on things like when you die, what happens with your inheritance and all these kind of things.
Yeah, estate tax on the richest people in the country.
Yeah, right. But these are people who are already taxed on that money once. So when
President Obama would go and say, their descendants weren't.
Yeah, right. And so we're going to take away more.
Conrad Hilton was taxed on his estate. When he made his money, but Paris Hilton was never taxed on it.
You want think Paris about how out of the mainstream you want to go sell to the American people, and that's be my guess if you do that after your family earns income, pays taxes on it, they can't give it to you without having to pay a massive penalty because of their hard work after they've paid their taxes, whether that's 51% or whether they raise it even higher. That they then can't give it to you. The American people don't buy that. The economic situation, when you start taxing to death people who make $250,000, $300,000 a year, I'm not talking about people who make millions of dollars a year.
Yes, you are. The estate tax only affects people above, $5 million?
Yeah, but I'm talking also about President Obama's tax increases on those who make $250,000 or more a year. That affects everyone. That affects the factory.
It
affects
2%.
The hospital. So you don't think it affects jobs at a corporation or a company?
Well, it's
how
true.
Can you make that? How can you not make that connection?
No, it's true. The yacht makers are suffering greatly after the tax
people who make $250,000 a year are not buying yachts. Let's be honest about that. What they're not doing is buying small boats either.
You make it appear as if it's only the people making $250,000. It's $250,000 and above. Okay.
Yeah, but
want
you
to
know how much
all of
bigger
them.
The group is between $250,000 to let's say $350,000, $400,000, and then the jump that you're talking about, these super rich, who, by the way, actually, when you get into those tax brackets, vote more Democrat than they do Republican, because they don't care so much about their taxes. But when you go so far to $250,000 a year, you are killing jobs. You're killing jobs because you're saying to the person at the boat manufacturer, you know what, I'm not going to buy the $25,000 boat this year because I can't afford it because of taxes. Who does that impact? Not just the person who wants to buy the boat for fun, the guys who build the boat who make $50,000 a year.
Your argument is very clear. And I know what we had when we had those tax cuts that you love and that you guys pushed for. We had a global economic collapse.
We're going to keep pushing for the tax cuts, and we'll see what happens in November.
Of course you are, because why not another global economic collapse?
Why not another Republican victory?
Have at it, Hoss. All right, Jordan Sekulow is the Director of International Operations for the American Center for Law and Justice. Jordan, thank you for joining us.
Very fun, thanks.
All right, Young Turks.